1 minute and allow people to join.
Maybe while folks are trickling in, I'll share my screen, Jen, if that's cool.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I will first introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Clayton. I am the New York State Bar Association's Attorney Wellbeing Program Manager. And each month we are highlighting one of the 8 pillars of attorney wellbeing, June being environmental wellness. And with that, I am pleased to welcome Nicole DeNamur, who is with us from Sustainable Strategies. Nicole, I will allow you to take over. Welcome.
Awesome. Okay, we're here now. It wouldn't let me unmute myself. Thanks, folks, for your patience with that. It's nice to see you all. And if you're so inclined to turn on your cameras, it's helpful for me to see your smiling faces, but I understand if you're maybe eating your lunch and don't want us to see that. So yeah, my name is Nicole DeNamur. I'll tell you a little bit about myself in a minute, but we're going to talk a little bit about ESG and attorney well-being, everything you want to know, but we're afraid to ask. And we're looking at kind of environmental health from the built environment, physical environments that surround you. So kind of as well as sustainability and other things, but there's a lot of different ways to interpret that. So I will hopefully dive right in. So yeah, this is me. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a lawyer and also a sustainability consultant. I practiced construction litigation, basically, and insurance coverage for most of my career. So I love buildings. My slice of sustainability is definitely in the built environment sector. I teach a sustainable development course here at the University of Washington. I should say I'm based in Seattle, so it's a little bit earlier here for me than most of you. I maintain an obnoxious number of sustainable building credentials, which are listed there: Lead Green Associate, Well AP and Faculty, Fitwell Ambassador, Eco Districts AP. I'm obviously very focused on the intersections of buildings with health and wellness, which if that intersection is new to you, don't worry, we'll talk it through. I'm also was recently named honorary member of the American Institute of Architects, Educator of the Year by the International Well Building Institute, and some other things. So I'm really privileged to have the chance to kind of share what I've learned through a winding journey of a career. It's also important to me to share that my company is a certified diverse owned firm. I'll talk about why that's important for ESG in a minute, but just highlighting it here, we're a certified women's business enterprise here at the state of Washington and a certified LGBT business enterprise through the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. And we're proud members of our local chapter here in Seattle, the Greater Seattle Business Association. Supplier diversity is a super important part of ESG, and it does relate to law firms. If you think that it only relates to product manufacturers, I'm here to tell you that differently. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but just want to kind of highlight that part of our business, because that's definitely something that's part of our ethos, is supporting other diverse owned firms. So I'm a teacher, so I like to tell you what I'm going to tell you the things, and then we'll make sure that we covered the things that we were supposed to, but these are the bullets that were a part of the introduction for today. So hopefully this is what you're hoping to learn, because that's what we're going to talk about. A little bit about ESG. And again, if that term is new to you, don't worry, we'll talk through it. And quite frankly, nobody really knows what it means. So it's okay, you're not alone. How does it show up for law firms? How does it relate to attorney well-being? I know that's really, obviously the focus of this group and organization and Jennifer's work. What to do when you get some requests for ESG related information. If you haven't gotten them yet, highly expect that you and your firm will. So help you get a little bit prepared. And then talk about some of the broader impacts. How can we think about some of the systemic challenges and changes that lawyers and law firms can drive, not only in their office spaces, but with aspects, like I said, like diversifying the supply chain and things like that. So I've also got a lot of things to share. If it's not obvious, I get really excited about this stuff. So I admittedly will probably go pretty fast. But here we are. So lots of folks ask me, where did ESG come from? just for context, you'll get a couple of different answers, but I think there's at least two kind of common threads. This is one that is commonly cited, the UN Principles of Responsible Investing. So in 2006, there was definitely this kind of first-ish reference to incorporating ESG issues into decision-making for financial sectors. There's lots of different ways to look at ESG. There's ESG investing as well as just ESG as a process. We're sticking mostly here with ESG kind of reporting as opposed to things like impact investing, although they are related. So if you want to impress your friends later, ESG, generally speaking, comes from the UN Principles for Responsible Investing, or that's where most people kind of think of it as coming from a practical standpoint. It also does show up in BlackRock and Larry Fink's letters to CEOs from around 2020. What's interesting is he didn't actually reference or say ESG, but framed it as a fiduciary obligation, it being kind of understanding and managing and planning for the impacts of a rapidly changing climate. And we were talking about this before we started, but if you have watched the news today, those impacts are very real today. We have a heat dome in the south, we have wildfire smoke in the Midwest and East, and a variety of stronger and more prevalent storms like thunderstorms and tornadoes. Climate change is very real and it is impacting us in real time. And so, that relates to ESG. We'll talk about that in a minute, but folks who ask, where does this come from? Definitely Larry Fink's letters. Interesting that within the past couple of days, he's backtracked on a lot of this, if you've been watching the news as well, but nonetheless, we're not here to talk about the backlash or the backtracking, but just where did this come from to give some context. So generally speaking, I'd say ESG and the reference to it, at least kind of more in the public space, comes from some of these letters from 2020. And you can go back online and read them all. It's kind of interesting to watch them, I guess, them change over time. So I won't spend too much time on the history of ESG, but I think it is kind of important to know where it came from. And then, like I was just talking about, the impacts of climate change, which impact all investments, including real estate, which is the space, as I said, I work the most in, is taking a huge hit. There's also a lot of authorship and communications lately with respect to the insurance industries. Having done insurance coverage work most of my career, that's something I keep an eyeball on. But we're seeing U.S. climate disasters racked up 165 billion in damage in 2022. Climate change is a very real risk, and it's impacting every single business, every business line, and the impacts are also disproportionate. We'll talk about some of those issues, but law firms are not exempt from the impacts of climate change, from ESG, and how that's kind of playing a part in assessing and managing those risks. So I think it's important for folks to keep an eye on that. So again, if the term ESG is new to you, that's totally okay. I was on a panel a couple of months ago and I said, and I will say it again, if you ask 10 ESG practitioners to define ESG, you get 10 different answers and none of them would be wrong. And I think that's still true. ESG is pretty nascent. Folks are still trying to explain and understand it. But the way that I like to think about it is it's a way of measuring, analyzing, and communicating information on a bunch of factors that loosely fit into those three buckets of environmental, social, and governance. Really not done this in business before. We really have to do it largely because of the realities of doing business in the modern world. And that's the other way that I just kind of think about ESG is it's a way of measuring, analyzing, and communicating those risks because our world is rapidly changing in all of those different contexts. There's a bunch of frameworks, an annoying number of acronyms, and lots of different ways to think about it. But I think if you just kind of think about ESG as basically a risk management strategy, I think that's kind of the easiest way to think it through. Lots of companies communicate their ESG strategies, metrics, and all sorts of other things. You can go online, find your favorite company, and Google their ESG report, and many specifically publicly traded companies will disclose those. If you have hours of time on your hands, you can read through the multi-hundred page, generally speaking, reports that are out there. But it's interesting to see what companies are reporting. So that's the way I think about it. If you're still a little bit like what falls in each of those buckets, I like to give folks a couple of examples. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but just to kind of help frame the discussion. Environmental, we often think about greenhouse gas emissions, water and other resource efficiency. Folks in my world look at building certifications, like your firm may be in a LEED certified office building, for example. Social factors or metrics, what might fit into that bucket would be things like stakeholder engagement. Are you actually engaging your stakeholders in decision-making? EDI work, community relations, things like that, diversity, board diversity, partnership diversity. And then governance, the way that I really think about it is good governance of the policies and procedures that help us, us being companies, actually implement the E and the S things that we want to do. It's kind of one way to look at it. So compensation policies, cybersecurity, other risk management policies, corruption, anti-bribery, things like that generally fall into governance. So just to kind of give some context, I'm very much oversimplifying the issues here, but just want to kind of give that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that then this is probably obvious, but there is overlap, right? From an academic standpoint or just the way our brains work, we put things in different buckets. So environmental social governance is just how this is shaken out. Obviously, there's lots of overlap. For example, we can't talk about environmental or a rapidly changing climate without talking about the fact that it is well documented that the impacts of climate change are disproportionate. They hit minority and marginalized communities first and hardest. So that obviously is a social metric too. So, and then health and wellness, I would argue falls into all of those. And that's, the focus of my work with respect to buildings, as well as all the different ways that health and wellness impacts folks. So that's a bit of context. Couple more things or resources, because ESG is really hard to define. It's changing a lot. It's nascent, and there's a lot of backlash around it. So I just offer a couple of additional quotes from things that I found. This is from a Thomson Reuters article. Its most basic form, ESG stands for environmental social governance. Collectively, it presents the ethical, moral, and cultural standards and processes in which a company has committed to operate. Stakeholders, investors, it's used to evaluate potential investment in a company. For employees and external vendors, it provides a window into the business's culture and priorities. So that's the way that I think that's a helpful way to kind of frame it up. Another example from our friends at Persephone, which is a consulting firm who does a pretty good job. And they put out a lot of great resources if you're ever looking for more info. They kind of frame it up as 3 overarching pillars that an organization's effect on the environment and society can be measured. It was initially used as a tool for investors, as I mentioned, to understand a company's long-term financial performance. I think this is the key. It's really now central to business strategies. It assesses a company's ability to deal with the defining issues of our time, the climate crisis, environmental degradation, social injustice, and inequality. So that's kind of some additional context. I think that might be helpful. What's really interesting about ESG at this point in time for the legal beagles out there is that it's one of the rare times where we have both market forces and regulatory requirements kind of colliding in the same space. So by market forces, I mean we have industry leaders, the Googles and Microsofts of the world, just naming 2, there's many others, who are pushing environmental and social factors for a long time and have done those things. I'm based in the Pacific Northwest. Obviously, we keep an eye on Microsoft, their leadership on carbon, for example. They've been doing it for a long time. And so that's like a market force, right? They're leading the industry. And then we also have regulatory requirements, potentially both here in the US, although that's taking a really long time, and in the EU and other places. So we kind of have this collision around ESG, which I think is a bit unique. Usually we see kind of a market force or a regulation driving something. We're really seeing both. That makes it a little bit confusing and a little bit unclear where it's going to go in the future. But I don't know, it's an observation that I think is important to make about the state of things. And I'll talk about the regulatory requirements in the US very briefly in a minute. So, but before we get there, more on what is ESG: person, place, or thing, process, report, risk management strategy. Kind of hard to put a finger on it, but I guess if I was going to think through the clients that I traditionally work with and the ESG reports that I see, it really kind of goes through sort of this 3-step process. So if you're thinking, what does this even mean? How do we get these reports? Where do they come from? Really kind of starts with the materiality assessment, which just means figuring out what the priorities are for the organization, because you can't do everything at once. Or please don't try, because it will just lead to sustainability overwhelm and frustration and throwing your hands up. Buy-in from leadership, stakeholder engagement, things like that. Then we move on to data collection and verification. ESG done really well. I think the key thing to remember is that it is data driven and transparent. I see companies get in trouble when they do things like estimate. And then reporting. There's various frameworks, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. But again, the kind of end product that a lot of consumers see, and also a lot of investors, although there's also some required filings, obviously, is those ESG reports, which you can go online and Google for your favorite publicly traded company and probably find them. There's some good, some bad, and a lot in the middle. So there's that. Because everyone thinks ChatGPT is interesting, I asked ChatGPT to define ESG just to see what it would say. It actually came up with a pretty good definition, which I have here on the screen if you want to be amused by that. But it basically says a set of criteria used to evaluate a company's performance in terms of its impact on the environment, society, and governance. Sounds very ChatGPT. ESG factors are used by investors and stakeholders to assess the sustainability and ethical impact of a company's operations and decision-making process. And then it goes on to describe some examples, which I already talked about, but I don't know, kind of fun to see what ESG might, or what ChatGPT might think about ESG. Again, give a pretty flat yet accurate definition. So ESG is filled with so many acronyms. And I think that's where people get frustrated. And so just want to touch on this a little bit, and we're going to get into how does this relate to health and wellness and buildings and all the things. But I get so many questions about ESG that I think it's important to kind of go through and explain it. So again, so many acronyms. We are rich with acronyms. But it's just kind of where things are. So I've put some of the different frameworks, as you remember from that kind of process, three-step process I had outlined there, the reporting. We use a variety of different frameworks to say, hey, this is how we're going to explain our environmental, social impacts and risks and our governance kind of strategies. There's the Global Reporting Initiative, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Read the rest that are on here. You've maybe heard of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. There's all kinds of different frameworks organizations can use to report on how they're doing on each of those three buckets of E, S, and G. Right now, well, I'll show this, I'll go back to that in a second. If you are looking for a resource, that's helpful. To explain these acronyms, I realize this is probably difficult to read, but the point is that this is from our friends at Verdani Institute, and I have the site down at the bottom of the slide here, but they've kind of aggregated the different reporting frameworks into these standards and guidelines. Voluntary disclosure, there are fun things like involuntary third-party aggregators who will go on the internet, find all the things they can about your company and give you a score, whether you like it or not. Through emissions initiatives, you probably heard a lot of those. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then some regulations in the US and elsewhere. So this is one of the best or better summaries I've found. So I just like to share with folks, if you Google Verdani Institute, this is their navigating ESG reporting frameworks. There's lots of other ones. Persephone puts out some good resources as well as Deloitte and other places, but just offer this as an example. And then, as I said, I don't really want to touch too much on the regulation of ESG in the US, but it is worth mentioning, we've been waiting on some standardization from the Securities and Exchange Commission on a variety of different ESG aspects. We could spend hours and hours and hours, and lots of folks have on regulation of ESG in the US. That's not what we're here to talk about, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention we are rich with acronyms. There's a lack of standardization that leads to a lot of confusion, and we are hoping to get some guidance, again, the market and regulatory forces colliding, around how to report ESG in a standardized way in the US relatively soon. We'll see. I've been waiting on those. There's some proposed rules out there. There's a lot of legal and other scholarship trying to understand and interpret them. I'll just leave it at that there is some proposed rulemaking out there, and we'll see kind of how that all shakes out in the US. I think the point is, and I'll make this later, ESG is here to stay, whether we call it that, whether we change the name, whether we just think about it as how we do business in light of all of the things and ways that the world is changing. So I generally talk to folks about avoiding any type of quote unquote backlash and just doing better business in the reality of the world. So I'll kind of leave it at that. So what does this process look like? How does this shake out for law firms? Like, what is this ESG thing? Is it even going to impact me? It is, and it does, and it will. Yes. How is it relevant to law firms? What's actually going on here? Let's talk about that. So how are ESG requests showing up? I'm seeing law firm clients getting requests for information regarding your firm's climate emissions. Maybe you've received something like that in the form of a letter, RFP. I see a lot of Excel files emailed to folks saying, put your numbers in here, which is kind of difficult. We see some new contractual mechanisms in vendor supplier contracts that are looking to enforce emissions reductions. I'll explain kind of how that works in a minute. And then we find both legal talent and other folks and clients shopping around to find vendors, including legal service providers whose climate and other goals are aligned with their own. And maybe you've experienced this. I'm seeing and hearing a lot more about it. So that's kind of how ESG shows up. As I said, if your firm has not yet received a request for this type of information, I don't say with 100% certainty, but it probably will very soon. This was some data from a 2021 survey from the Law Firm Sustainability Network that said that 87% of responding law firms said they'd received requests for proposals that included their firm's at least environmental efforts. Tend to kind of like lead with climate because numerically have a pretty solid understanding of how to account for carbon and other related environmental impacts. And then obviously there's lots of room for improvement on the social metrics. But so the point is, if you have not yet received requests, you probably will. So lawyers and law firms tend to have the largest environmental impacts in their leased office space. That's why me, a real estate person, is here talking to you about these things, as well as the second most significant impacting area tends to be travel. Whether that's lawyers flying around, whether you're flying your experts around, witnesses, or going to conferences, which is a whole nother conversation. So for most lawyers and law firms, the environmental impacts are office space and travel. Those tend to be the two largest ones. And then there's lots of opportunities in the kind of social and governance aspects, which we'll talk about in a minute here. I also would be remiss if I didn't see this kind of example of climate shaming, which is from the LA Times, Meet the Law Firms Helping Fossil Fuel Companies Heat the Planet. Clients are shopping around, asking their lawyers about their other clients, who else they're representing, and those types of things. This all kind of begs a really complicated conversation around, is it important to help fossil fuel industries transition to a clean energy economy? I have a lot of good data and opportunities there, or just stop representing those clients. And I think a lot of folks would say it's important to work with folks to try to help them be more sustainable and contribute to clean energy. But that's a very layered conversation, probably for another day, but something to think about. And nonetheless, we're seeing headlines like this. So it's important to think about and get your own firm's kind of house in order of, what are you doing? Who are you representing? How are you operating with respect to your own processes? So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. And so I'll just pause there for a second and see if everybody's still with me or has any questions, because I know that was a lot in 20 minutes, 25 minutes. All right. Folks look okay. So with all of that kind of context, a little quick lesson on climate and how your firm and your impacts as part of your client's supply chain is important to them, and how you can help them meet their climate goals, and why your firm is probably getting these types of requests for climate related information. So let me kind of explain that so that we can help you think about how health and wellness plays in, and also how to respond to these requests. And so this is quite staggering statistic. Nearly 1/5 of the world's largest publicly traded companies have made some type of climate commitment. These are varying levels of robustness. You'll commonly see a net zero by this and that. Insert specified date. There's lots of greenwashing around this, which is kind of misrepresenting, intentionally or unintentionally, sustainability, broadly speaking. So these are kind of complicated claims that companies are making, but nonetheless, they're making them. And in order to achieve those types of commitments, they need the cooperation of their supply chain. I'll show you a chart on this in a minute, because supply chain emissions can account for a significant share of the organization's total impacts. And so that's why we're seeing these increasing requests for supply chain information, including service providers like law firms. So if that's a little confusing, let me present a chart. So if in climate accounting kind of world, we tend to put things in buckets of scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, and scope 3 emissions. There are other scopes, but let's just focus on these three. They're the most common ones. So if you're looking at this from the perspective of, I like to give an example, as most law firms represent some type of technology company. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have lots of technology companies. So scope 1 for your technology client would be any direct emissions that they own from owned assets, right? So any real estate, vehicles, or things like that. Scope 2 is all the electricity that they purchase, all the emissions associated with that. And then scope 3 is all the indirect emissions from up and down their supply chain. And that includes my little tiny arrow here, service providers. So you as a law firm are a service provider to your technology client. Your firm's emissions count in their scope 3 if they're doing a robust type of climate accounting, as does any leased assets that your client has, any of their business travel. So everybody kind of goes down the supply chain and it gets further and further and further down. So if your technology client is looking at their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, they need information and cooperation from you as part of their supply chain in order to meet their climate goals. And that's why law firms are getting these types of requests among many other service providers, right? And building operators who own those leased assets and transportation companies. And that's why companies like, if you've gone on Google, you can now see the impacts of various flights, the carbon impacts, and you can actually choose less impacting travel if you want to kind of go that way. So there's lots of tools available for those types of things. But I like to give this kind of little chart. So if we put that chart in words for folks who might learn better this way, I would think about it as scope 1 is, again, all emissions from real estate and assets. Scope 2 is all electricity that's purchased, heating and cooling, like literally utility bills. And then scope 3 is literally everything else. And for some companies, like you can imagine, like Walmart's of the world, their scope 3 is almost 90% of their emissions, because what they do is they take things, they ship them from one place to a central place, and then they send them home with various consumers, right? And so that scope 3, all of that transportation, all those service providers, all those vendors that bring this stuff, and all the consumers that take the stuff home and use it, are their scope 3. Their scope 1 is actually pretty small because they just have these big boxes and they have relatively small speaking utility bills. So for some companies, scope 3 is a huge deal. And that's why your firms as service providers to this like hypothetical technology company, you're part of their scope 3 emissions. And that's why they're asking these questions. Like, tell us about your leased space, tell us about your employee travel, and then moving into social metrics, tell us about your partnership diversity, hiring, mentorship practices, as we kind of flow into the S and then G aspects. Tend to lead with environment, again, because I think we have relatively well-established ways to count carbon. So that kind of tends to go first. So hopefully that makes sense and gives some context as to why your firm might be getting these questions from your clients. I'm going to go really quickly through a couple of slides here that demonstrate some of the questions that come from these different frameworks that I showed on that kind of slide with the white background and the different columns of like, what do these different ESG frameworks look like? Because I think ESG can be tough to understand for a variety of reasons. One is if you've never actually answered these questions, you might be like, what is this? So just take these as examples of the types of questions that come from some of these frameworks that we use in ESG land to get to the S and G metrics. So as I just described, this is from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So if your client was using this reporting framework, they might ask questions like, they would get asked questions like disclosure scope 1, 2, and if appropriate is obviously a keyword, but we'll just take that as scope 3. So that's why they might be asking you as they're part of their scope 3 for some information. If we look to another example here, for governance and environment, because these things overlap, right? So they might say disclosure organizations governance around climate related risks and opportunities, board oversight, management's role in assessing these things. So these kind of get to the governance and environmental intersection. So your client would be answering these types of questions, or your firm, and I've seen some very large multinational firms do their own ESG reporting, maybe answering these types of questions yourselves. Again, just to give some examples of what these questions might look like. So what's like a question that relates to a social metric from the Global Reporting Initiative, description of occupational health and safety, any work-related hazards, training, things like that. So that makes sense that would be kind of a social metric. Again, we're putting these in kind of artificial buckets just for the purposes of understanding, because the way our brains work, quite frankly. And then governance, describe the process that you manage conflicts of interest, you prevent and mitigate those. So again, good governance, how do we think things through? So I know I went through those quickly, but I just want folks to kind of have an understanding of what do those questions actually look like. If your firm might be answering ESG related questions or getting them from your clients, because they're usually going to come again down the supply chain to you as kind of a supplier and scope 3. And that's why it was important to me to talk about my firm's, for example, diverse designation as a diverse supplier. We'll get to that in a second. So hopefully that's okay and not totally overwhelming. take a sip of my water here and let you think about it. All right. So how does all of this ESG stuff intersect with health and wellness and is specific to law firms, right? So as we talked about, social metrics, there is aspects related to recruiting and retaining diverse talent in these spaces. And again, I look at these issues through the lens of someone who's focused on buildings and spaces, right? So we also see clients looking for service providers that align with their values. Your office space is a physical manifestation of your firm's values. I'll say this like 15 times. As well as everyone deserves the opportunity to do their best work. We'll talk about some of the ways that equity or inequity intersects with the built environment and office design. So thinking about what does your office space say about your firm in particular? So start thinking about these things. There's a couple of reports that literally came up this week. That's why these slides are just quotes, because I had a chance to like process all of them. But I think it's important to talk about how workplace intersects with well-being. And if we're going to talk about under the larger umbrella of ESG, we're kind of looking at those social metrics and how they play in. So you can see these are kind of like puzzle pieces that we have to line up because ESG is not standardized, because it's in flux, and because it's kind of nascent. But I think this is interesting. This comes from Deloitte, just did a survey on workplace well-being. 60% of employees, 64% of managers, and 75% of C-suites are seriously considering quitting for a job that would better support their well-being. And then this is the one, most employees say their health has worsened or stayed the same last year, but 3 out of 4 executives believe that their workforce, that their health has improved. So there's obviously a disconnect here. Employees are like, we're struggling, and managers are like, everything's better. So how do we help with some of those disconnects? And there are ways we can do that through the built environment, among many other strategies that Jennifer's work and others intersect with. So kind of want to highlight that from Deloitte. Folks have probably seen this report that is very much a focus of the lawyer well-being movement, but just pulling out a couple highlights that relate to the stuff that I work on. Lawyer health is an important form of human capital that can provide a competitive advantage. Hopefully that's obvious to folks if you're here, but if not, it is. We got lots of research to support that. I'll go through some of that. As I mentioned, folks are looking for firms that support their values, and one way to express what your firm does and how you operate in the world is through ESG metrics and kind of social aspects. So this headline here again from Thomson Reuters: talent and ESG top concerns as firms find new ways of working, because the world is changing. Several firms reported they consider attorney well-being to be one of their biggest priorities, and law firms are recognizing and attempting to provide services that alleviate impact their lawyers' mental health. The built environment, your physical office space, is a huge part of this conversation, even though it is often left out. So I'll tell you all the ways we can fix that. A couple more things here around health and well-being. This is a little bit dated, I think, at this point, but Gallup asked employees what they look for most in an employer, that the organization cares about the employees' well-being, and their top 3 criteria for millennials and Gen Z, it's number 1. Your office space is the first thing that people see when they visit. Clients, employees, future employees, current employees, guests. So it's a huge part of the cues that people are picking up on as to whether or not they're welcome there, whether it's a sustainable space, whether it's a safe space, what your firm's values really are. And so there's lots of connections there. I think they're often not made, so I'm here to highlight those. So again, I talk about buildings, right? And so what are some of the kind of building scale benefits? So if each of you that are here think about your office space, or maybe an office space you've worked in previously, we could kind of think about those spaces and how they operate, right? And so when we provide some of these health and wellness strategies, which I'll explain some examples in a minute, so just stick with this for now. When we deliver kind of health and wellness strategies through the office space, there's a couple of cool things about that. One is that it doesn't require opt-in. Folks don't have to wear a Fitbit, for example, which is a common corporate wellness strategy. There's nothing wrong with Fitbits per se, but it does require some opt-in, right? And that doesn't work for everyone, and for a variety of reasons. What's nice about building scale benefits is everybody who moves through the space, who uses an office space, receives the benefits of, like, for example, improved air quality or biophilic design, which is just bringing some nature inside to our kind of unnatural world. It also doesn't require folks to disclose any personal information. I'll talk about some examples of support for a neurodiverse workforce in a minute, and how office spaces can support a neurodiverse workforce. And instead of having to say, well, this space is quote unquote different, instead we just create better spaces that work better for everyone, and folks don't have to disclose personal information, or you don't have to use a different restroom. You just have a better space that works better for everybody. And that's why I get really excited about building scale benefits. There's lots of intersections with environmental, social, a little bit less with governance, but it goes to how you actually operate your office space. And so those are important intersections with ESG and health and wellness. A couple more examples that I often like to give is I see firms doing great work with respect to policies, or new parent policies, opportunities to support mental health, take breaks, have quiet or meditative time. But what happens is the office space doesn't actually support implementation of that policy. So for example, good friends, their company is called Mindful Return. And if you haven't looked them up, please look them up. They do a lot of great work with new parent support. And so like a firm might have a great policy for new parents, but in reality, the office space, they'll show me their new parent support room, and it's really like a back closet with no windows and no lock, no refrigeration, nothing like that. None of the things that new parents need to support their little kiddos. And so there's a great policy, but it can't actually be implemented, or can't get the full value of that because the office design doesn't support it in a meaningful way. So those are some design disconnects and ways that office spaces can really add to this. Another example is when I was litigating construction matters, I went to therapy at lunch, which one, normalized talking about therapy, and two, and my firm was super supportive. It was a benefit that I received through the firm. And but you need a couple minutes to decompress after therapy, right? And that's totally appropriate. And again, super supportive, but there was just nowhere to do that, right? I had one of those classic law firm offices with, glass wall, everybody could see it in, and there wasn't anywhere I could just go for 5 minutes and just be quiet and still. And before jumping into a call, try and write a brief or whatever it is, because we need to have those spaces for reflection. And so instead, or I guess in addition to that policy, firms can also create spaces where there's an opportunity for meditation, prayer, reflection, whatever folks need to support their mental health. And then obviously some training and normalization around, like, yeah, you don't come in and interrupt me when I'm in that space. If there's a call, the building better be on fire if anybody's coming in, or things like that, right? There's obviously some training and education pieces to this, but it's important to talk about how great policies sometimes don't have the intended effect, that positive effect that we want them to, because the spaces don't support that work. And that's why I'm so focused on office spaces and health and wellness. So I talk a lot about healthy buildings. I've just mentioned it like 15 times. And obviously I'm a well-accredited professional. So if you've heard of LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, you may work in a LEED certified building, very prominent third-party green building certification program, particularly here in the US. They do great stuff. There is, I guess maybe I'd call it similar framework that has a focus on the occupant health and wellness, and that's called the WELL building standard. LEED has aspects of health and wellness, WELL has aspects of environmental support. They're not mutually exclusive, they're just different tools. But I'm a well-accredited professional and WELL faculty, and I kind of provide this chart from the International WELL Building Institute, and what it's showing here is the square footage. It's actually a little bit dated at this point. That's been certified under their program, and just how much that demand for healthier spaces has increased. Now you can see, where the pandemic obviously had an impact, because it got people thinking about office spaces and air quality, which is a huge part of healthy buildings. But they've just seen exponential growth. So the demand for healthier buildings is not just something that I'm saying is there, it's very data driven. And there's WELL, and as I mentioned in the introductory slide, I'm also a FitWell ambassador. There are a variety of tools to kind of think about or structure what it means to be a healthy building. And if that's not clear, there's a couple, I like to offer kind of the academic, I guess, definition is kind of the way I think about it as well. What is a healthy building? A lot of the research that I use comes from Harvard School of Public Health, and they've developed this academic framework that they call the 9 foundations of a healthy building. There are other ways to think about healthy buildings. There are some Some folks might add things to this list, some folks might take things away. Just like ESG, there's different ways to define a healthy building. Got to do what works best for you and your organization, but this is one way, and it's developed in the academic context, which is the reason I like to share it with folks. And so you could say, well, a healthy building kind of looks at these 9 factors or aspects: ventilation, air quality, thermal health, moisture, dust and pests, safety and security, water quality, noise or acoustics, and lighting and views. And I'm not going to talk about all of these today, but I am going to talk about 2 of them that I think are most relevant to law firms. Those are air quality and more inclusive design, and that also relate to environmental social governance, which is what we're also here to talk about. So this is a super interesting study. So this is a joint study between Harvard School of Public Health and Syracuse University. It's called the COG Effect Study. You can go online and learn more about it. The citation is at the bottom, but I think the highlights are, I'll actually go to, where am I here? This slide, which I think is a little bit better for visual learners. I'm a visual learner. So what they did here is they took a traditional baseline office building, and which you can imagine what that looks like, and put a bunch of knowledge workers in it, and then tested their cognitive performance. Actually, Syracuse had that piece. Harvard was doing the kind of building side. And so they tested their cognitive performance. And then, days later, they decreased the level of volatile organic compounds, which are probably the most common indoor pollutant. They come from, if you recognize like what you would probably call a new car smell, those are VOCs. They're in carpets, paint. You've probably seen low VOC paint because most paints have high VOCs. Those whiteboard markers, printer toner, anything that smells kind of weird and makes you feel lightheaded is probably a VOC. We bring ourselves inside. We spend 90% of our time indoors, and where pollutant levels can be 2 to 5 times higher. So anyways, in this study, what they did was they decreased the level of this common indoor pollutant, and the cognitive scores of the folks in that space improved by 61% just by reducing the level of those indoor pollutants. And then in the third context, they reduced the VOC levels and increased the ventilation rates. You could think of that as the functional equivalent of opening a window. If you're working from home, I happen to be sitting in front of a window and assuming that there's no wildfire smoke outside. And when they did that, those 2 metrics, cognitive scores increased by 101%. So there's real cognitive performance benefits associated with one healthy building strategy like air quality. And I don't know why law firms are not more focused on this, but I'm here to share the information. And this quote on the bottom, the largest effects were seen for crisis response, information usage, and strategy, 3 areas that we really want lawyers and support staff to be able to focus on. This is why 911 call centers often bring in things like oxygen and to improve their air quality. That's sort of a different context of moving out CO2, but there's lots of reasons how air quality impacts cognitive performance. And I love to share this with legal audiences because I think it's super important. If you're working from home and the air is safe outside, which is a big caveat, I always encourage folks to crack the window. So that's one example of a healthy building and how that you can imagine how that or healthy building strategy, I should say, and how that relates to the wellness of the folks that are in those spaces, and also an ESG metric. So another one I want to talk about is inclusive design. This kind of gets to the social metric, as well as something that's super important to me, which is creating safer, more inclusive spaces that work better for everyone. So the data that I cite is the 2015 US trans survey. It's Pride Month, so it's important to talk about these data points that are out there. This survey was re-administered in 2022. We are anxiously awaiting the new data. It's expected to be released this year, and if you've been watching the news as well, you know that the attacks on the trans community have only intensified over the past couple of years. So we expect this shocking data here to only be worse. What that does is it helps advocates like me advocate for safer spaces. So the data we have from 2015 shows that more than half of respondents avoided using a public restroom in the past year because they're afraid of confrontations. Nearly a third limited amount they ate and drank to avoid using a restroom in the past year. So folks aren't like sacrificing their nutrition and hydration in order to avoid harassment. And 8% reported having urinary tract infection, kidney infection, or other related issues as a result of just not using a restroom because it's an unsafe space. So buildings can be unsafe spaces. If I walk into a potential client's office and there's a men's and women's restroom, it's a very clear signal to me that I'm not welcome there and I'm not safe there. And so how do we create more safer and more inclusive spaces? There's a couple ways. And so I just want to offer a couple images and we'll go through this pretty quickly. Obviously, all of this needs to be supported with training and education. if we're going to do things like change restroom signage. But these are a couple examples because I often get the, well, we can't do that, or the building code says we can't do that. That's not accurate. So here in this color image is an example from Town Hall Seattle, which is a community nonprofit space where you have single stalled restrooms and there's a common sink at the end that you can't really see. Great things about this are there's infant changing stations. So anyone who needs to change an infant can do so, not just folks who use a women's restroom. And we also see an increased demand for adult changing and adult support stations because lots of folks are caring for aging parents, for example, or just caregivers for other folks. And so it's important to have those opportunities as well. So folks can get out, enjoy nonprofit spaces, go to the movies, all that kind of stuff. And so we can create spaces that work better just for everyone through design like this, and also through changing signage around. This again requires a lot of training and education. This is actually an example from a dance studio in Boston, I think, but basically what they did was they just have signage that says, this is what's in this space, use what you need. I like this example. You may have seen things that are like a depiction of what most people would understand as still binary and say, use what you want. I don't prefer that. This is my preferred alternative because it perpetuates things that we don't want to. So I like this because it just shows what's in the space, use what you need. Restrooms are something that everybody needs. It's kind of like the one common denominator. And it's a way that we can make spaces safer, again, as long as we support it with training and education and have conversations like this. I never thought as a sustainability consultant that I would end up talking about inclusive restrooms as much as I do, but here we are. So it's important to talk about and we can do better. So similarly, and kind of related is support for a neurodiverse workforce. This gets a lot to the return to work conversation, which is I get asked literally every day. But we can create office spaces that support more users and where more users can do their best work. Because again, everybody deserves the right to do their best work. How do we create office spaces that help folks do that? About 15 to 20% of folks identify as neurodivergent. So we can use universal design strategies, clear wayfinding, which means in the law firm example, I always share that like visiting a lawyer, even under the best circumstances, is probably at least a little bit stressful. And if you can't find the front desk when you visit a new space for the first time, or if you can't find a restroom, and particularly an inclusive restroom, that just makes these experiences even more stressful, particularly for folks who are already experiencing stress for a variety of reasons. So your office can have what we call clear wayfinding. Come off the elevator, you can see the front desk, there's a helpful person to greet you there, and there's a restroom because everybody needs one of those. So things like clear wayfinding, spatial organization and character within the space, degree of stimulation. Do we have spaces that are louder and quieter, louder for more collaboration, quieter for more focused work, something in the middle for folks who need a little bit of background noise, varied levels of social exposure so folks know and can anticipate and don't have stress around, am I going to have conversation with a bunch of folks, or can I just sit down and do my work? Lots of different ways. And I think it really comes down to, if you kind of read the literature on support in the office space, choice and trust. So providing folks the opportunity to have choice in where they work and trusting them to make the choice that meets their own needs. I like this quote with dignity and autonomy. If I asked all of you to kind of picture a law firm office, we would all picture sort of the same thing. And that type of thing only works really for one group of users. And we need spaces that work for more users. And folks are looking for that. This gets to the recruiting and retaining talent. It gets to ESG and a lot of other aspects. We can tie these building design kind of themes into the broader issues that we've talked about. And with respect to turning to the office, I get asked all the time, how do we get people back to the office? And if you're phrasing it in that way, you're already off on the wrong foot. So what we really need to do is kind of, if I take my slide and start from the bottom here, if your office is a safe, welcoming, inclusive space where your employees and guests feel valued because their health and wellness is prioritized and they can see that and it's been communicated to them clearly, attracting them back to the office will be much easier. Forcing employees back to the office is one, not going to work, and two, has disproportionate impacts on folks who've been able to work really well at home and may experience a variety of challenges in that type of forced transition. So we need to provide support for folks for going back to the office if that's something they're going to mandate. I think a much better strategy is saying, here is a space where you feel safe and welcome. You have choice and autonomy. We want you to do your best work. We're celebrating everybody who's here and setting everybody up for success. People will come back to those spaces. So there's lots of ways to communicate building scale benefits, often through certification, like well or fit well, or just working with your communications team and saying, hey, here's what we're doing, accurately communicating those things. Healthy buildings are a huge part of supporting these kind of safer workspaces and broader equity, diversity, and inclusion work for kind of all the reasons I just gave. Again, this research just came out this week, so I'm just sharing a couple of quotes on this really bland slide, but be remiss if I didn't share the latest things. So this is from Savills. They did their law firm return to office survey. 90% of firms have implemented policies regarding office attendance for their attorneys. The majority mandate or suggest 3 in-office days per week. Maybe you've done the same. They report about 55% of attorneys in the office 3 or more days per week. And 60% are adopting or considering flexible office hoteling, as opposed to that, like this is your office with a glass door, and other opportunities. So again, I think this, if you are mandating a return to the office, thinking about those disproportionate impacts and supporting folks who need it, and also creating spaces that people want to go back to. And another way to do that is really creating a different experience than folks have in the work from home experience. So why would I go to that space? What's different about it than my work from home experience? And it can be a lot of different things. So kind of wrapping up here right about on time, and time for a couple questions. I see there's a couple in the chat. If there is one thing I leave y'all with, one is everyone deserves the right to do their best work. Office spaces are a huge part of that. The second space is your office space is a physical manifestation of your firm's values. It's the first thing clients, employees, and guests see and experience, and it says a lot about you, more than any website. How do people feel in that space? Like I said, if I walk into an office and there's a men's and a women's restroom, I'm out of there. It's really a way to demonstrate to folks that you care about their health and wellness through that design. I'm going to skip through this. Is just talking a little bit about the importance of good governance. This is like way in the ESG weeds. To get to kind of like, what should you do next? Lots of folks ask me like, what do we do now? This ESG thing feels overwhelming. I guess what I'd say first is you're not alone if you feel overwhelmed. I work with a lot of clients who come to me with just that like 2 or 3 phone calls on this yesterday. What do we do? I feel overwhelmed. I'm getting these requests. I don't know what to do. So a couple of things: develop at least a baseline understanding of your firm's climate impacts. There's lots of consultants like me and many others who can help you with that. Again, consider that for most law firms, leased office space and travel are generally the 2 biggest sources of climate emissions. So if you are looking at moving to a new space or downsizing your space or moving into a new space, asking questions about the building. I see more and more, I don't think it was actually on the slide that I shared earlier, but potential candidates, what we call interviewing the building, saying, tell me about this space, and maybe show me the restrooms, show me, do you have a meditation room? What do you have for new parent support? Where's my office? Can I move around? Those types of things. And so just taking a look at your office space, if you're going to make a move, and lots of firms are making lots of moves. We are in a very interesting market here in the Pacific Northwest, for example, and tenants have a lot of power to ask questions and to ask for better of their office spaces. So there's free and paid tools out there. There's consultants like me, there's YouTube videos, there's lots of resources to help folks on their journey. And prepare for those kind of requests for information related to environmental, as I just mentioned, and social and governance questions. So folks are asking about partnership composition and compensation, types of clients the firm represents. That gets to that kind of the shaming aspect, I guess. And again, thinking about helping clients on their journey. Are there ways that you as a lawyer and counselor can help folks understand the importance of climate work instead of just maybe dumping clients who maybe do problematic work, saying, hey, let's work together on this journey. And that's, I think, really what lawyers are here for, is to help. So hiring, promotion, and mentorship, office space, looking at kind of all these different aspects, meaning do you hire, promote, and mentor diverse folks? Do you think consciously about your office space and how it represents your firm? There's lots of ways to think about ESG. Leading law firms are really looking at using the building level strategies to attract the best talent. And also diversifying your supply chain. I know this is probably, I think, the 3rd time I brought this up. But if we're looking at the S aspect of ESG, there's lots of opportunities to engage a diverse supply chain. So maybe that catering service that you've always used, you could consider using a veteran-owned catering service, or janitorial service, look at a WBE or DBE, or something like that, or even looking at the merchandise. All firms have the like zip ups and the sweatshirts and stuff like that. Are those coming from just a really big conglomerate company that you don't know, or did you maybe engage a diverse-owned firm? I had, for example, patches made for my company, and we worked with a veteran-owned firm. And to have that done, it takes, an extra 15 seconds to do a Google search and find a different vendor and give a small diverse business an opportunity. And there's lots of folks out there. So why not diversify your supply chain? I think that's a key step that law firms can really take a leadership role on. It's obviously something that's important to me as well. And I'm kind of just running up on time here, so we're great. So I guess what I leave folks with is this quote, that sufficiently addressing ESG is no longer solely an environmental social problem. It's now an issue with repercussions for many companies' bottom lines. I would just, again, think about ESG as the reality of doing business in today's world, which demands doing a better job on climate, doing a much better job on social issues, and running our businesses in a way that enforces both of those things, and looks at things like diversity in the supply chain and promotion, mentorship, and things like that. ESG is not going anywhere. There's going to be a backlash. It's going to be called different things, all of that. Encourage folks to ignore that noise and just do better from a business standpoint. And there's lots of opportunities for law firms to do that. So we are, I don't know, about maybe 3 minutes left. So this is me. You're welcome to reach out. My email, my website. Use that little link code to find more stuff. I will drop in the chat. We have a course on healthy law firms, and goes into the 9 strategies I mentioned, as well as ESG. So I'll drop that in the chat here for folks. And I didn't get a chance to look at the questions. So Jennifer, is there anything no? Okay. No questions. If anybody has any questions, I've got maybe, I don't know, a minute or so. I want to keep people on time. And other than that, would just thank folks for the chance to share. Office design is a super important part of health and wellness, and I think it's an overlooked part of the conversation. And hopefully I've made the case that it should be much more centered. Your office space really means a lot, and it's a huge part of your health and wellness strategy for lawyers and law firms. And there's lots of folks out there who can help you with that. So that's me. Let me know. Other than that, Jen, anything else?
No, I'll give it our 2 minutes to see if any questions
Okay, 2
come
minutes.
in. But thank you so much, Nicole. This is Nicole's second time working with the Attorney Wellbeing Program. As you can see from this presentation, the Attorney Wellbeing Program is looking at wellness from so many different facets. And there is so much that really contributes to our well-being. So I will be sending out the information shared here on this slide and some other additional material to each of you. You'll be receiving that via email from me directly. And again, Nicole's contact information is here if you have any questions.
Totally.
Thank you all so much, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it. Go make your office spaces better.
All right. Well, thank you all, and lots of thank yous in the chat coming through. So
Awesome.
take care, everyone, and have a great afternoon.